You're listening to the Futures Podcast, live from SPACE4, a haven for digital cooperation, physically located just a stone's throw from Finsbury Park Station in London. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, others might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'm your host for this evening. In 2012, I made the largest financial mistake of my life. My then flatmate met me in a dingy Wetherspoons pub outside of Snow Hill Station in Birmingham and tried to convince me to buy Bitcoin. For around £80, he was offering me a chance to be part of the brand new digital money revolution. I asked him, what can I use it for? And he responded, well, I'm using it to buy things off this website called Silk Road. My response was, dude, I don't want to buy any of your effing drug money. Fast forward to 2024, and I believe that he's now living in Asia, living off the cash that he made when he sold plenty of his Bitcoins, that's plural, back in late 2020. So any experts in the room can work out how financially flush my flatmate is right now. You see, this is the issue with any conversation around crypto or the blockchain technology that enables it. We all have immediate preconceived notions of what it is, and these associations limit how we think about its possibilities and its capabilities. As our guest this evening, Josh Dávila, shows in his new book, Blockchain Radicals, this public perception of Web 3.0 has largely been informed by techno-libertarian narratives, Twitter bros, the biases of commercialism, and the structures of capitalism. This has overshadowed the burgeoning technology's radical potential for fostering a more equitable and decentralized world. So, to show us how to reclaim the potential of blockchain to catalyze societal transformations beyond its capitalist confines, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Josh Dávila to the Futures Podcast stage. Josh, I mentioned there in the introduction this idea that we have these preconceived notions of what blockchain technology or Bitcoin is, and it's something called representational thinking, isn't it? That informs the way we think about crypto technologies.
Yeah, so a big part of the thesis of the book is I use a framework from Gilles Deleuze, which is called the critique of representational thinking, in which he's saying that oftentimes we take models of the old and try to map on top of it things that are new in order for it to fit within the models of the way that we think about the world. And this is very problematic because it limits the way that we think about new things, and particularly in technology. So like the example that I give is the drum machine. The drum machine was a piece of technology that was created in order to replace your drummer in band practice, right? Drummer couldn't come, so you bought the machine, you press the buttons, you set up the beats that you wanted, you press play, and you strum your guitar along. And that was like the point of the drum machine when it was originally intended. But what actually happened in history is that, of course, people put the knob up to 11 and played beats that no drummer could ever play. So rather than being a representation of a drummer with a drum set, it was actually instead its own thing. Right, it was limited by the representational model. It's kind of almost like it was as if it was guardrails, but actually it could be something of itself, not just a representation of the, like ideally you want your drummer to come to band practice. So the drum machine is a replacement. Instead, the drum machine is actually something itself. And so this is something that is part of the thesis, is that this is like everywhere in the crypto world. Everywhere you look, there's always some sort of like representation or metaphor being imposed upon what crypto is or what it ought to be. And that's kind of what I found very problematic in having any sort of conversation with people about this stuff.
Well, let's look at what the book really focuses on, which is that idea of what blockchain ought to be. So in what way can we create new maps or new metaphors for this blockchain or crypto technology?
Yeah, I mean, there are so with the book, the way I go through like a chronological order of how the metaphors have changed. First, like it was really about money. So the first section is crypto as money. The second section is crypto as finance. And the third section is crypto as coordination. So you see that like over time, the metaphor, the dominant metaphor in the crypto world, the narrative is like getting bigger and bigger, right? Trying to map a larger and larger territory as people are actually using the technology and figuring out what it can and can't do. And so we have to create like a new metaphor to kind of fit what it is. And so for me, it's less about trying to find like the perfect metaphor that will fit it of what it is, but instead like breaking it up into perhaps smaller pieces. That perhaps this like application for what you want to use it for is perhaps similar or mimics something out there in the world that exists today that you can kind of make a comparison to make it easier to understand. But we can't have this kind of like totalizing narrative about what this thing is, because it constantly changes and we're constantly discovering kind of like new things that we can and like not can, but also maybe should not do as well, like should or should not do. So yeah, that's kind of, I don't know if that was a non-answer, but.
Well, part of that totalizing is because of who gets to own the metaphor or who gets to own the meme. So largely, part of this problem is the fact that blockchain technologies, the way in which they're talked about is usually in association with a certain group of individuals, isn't it?
Rich people or people making money, libertarians, dudes.
My flatmate like from 2012.
Sure, yeah.
But more specifically, it seems to be, at least in online conversations, that the far right, libertarians, folks who love their exploitative capitalism, I mean, they own the meme, they own the metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So like one of the kind of uncomfortable truths for sure is that Bitcoin came from a pretty like right-wing political perspective. Like the reasoning for why people wanted to make it and make it exist came from a pretty like economically conservative idea about what money should be. Like that money should be like the gold standard, that it should be something that is scarce, that is hard to get, and that becomes more expensive over time, so that me as a good person who saves my money will be richer in the end. This obsession with like that inflation is the cause of every single ill in the world, and that deflation would somehow solve every problem and make my father love me. So like there is an issue with like kind of this starting narrative that makes it very difficult to also break, because what is often missed, right? There's a famous book out there actually that I saw on the table, Columbia's, the right-wing politics of Bitcoin. There's a lot of truth in the book. Kind of like one of the things that is lost in this kind of critique is that like it's software, and software can very easily change. So the right-wing politics of Bitcoin is really embedded in particular in this like 21 million cap. Right? There's only going to be 21 million ever in existence of Bitcoin, and then it'll stop. And then everyone who got Bitcoin is going to become a millionaire. It's like a self-referential kind of narrative to make yourself rich. Someone could just as easily change that 21 million to not exist. You can change it to a different number. You can change the kind of like inflation schedule. All of this is like modifiable with like just typing in a couple of different digits, a couple of different functions, and it can do something else, or it can be imbued with a different politics than the one that is implied in the Bitcoin one. And so like there is this kind of like discomfort with the fact that Bitcoin being the first, being the biggest, being the most overtly like right libertarian kind of politically something, then it dominates the narrative a lot.
So in that case, how do we retrieve the meme? It feels like because it is so heavily associated with right-wing politics, and the technology then is assumed to have its own politics, that the left, they almost abandon it, or they just spend their time critiquing it. Is it possible to use it to other ends?
Short answer, yes. Longer answer, it means it takes a lot of work. It's not so simple. Or it's not easy, I would say. It's like it's definitely a project to take on of reclaiming, or not even reclaiming, just like fucking taking. I mean, stealing. Sorry if I can't. Sorry. And using it for something else. I mean, it's like about doing the thing that it is useful for in your communities for your political objectives, and doing that. Like, that should be like the priority for me. It's not really about like, let's make crypto left wing. Like, I think that's kind of like that's like a silly like argument to get into, but should be more about like, use it for how you are going to like fund the political activity that you want to be a part of, like to create the political economy that you want to create. There are things that cryptocurrencies can do that you do, or that you can do with, that you otherwise cannot do in like the standard financial system, for example. And that should be taken seriously. If you are like on the left and you want to talk about like challenging capitalist institutions, the first thing that they're going to do, if you really challenge them, is block your bank account. It's the easiest thing that they can do, and it immediately prevents you from being able to get your basic needs met, because it's essentially like, it's like a leash, you know, like the privatized financial system where we put all of our money into banks. The banks will do whatever the state says. If you're challenging the states, they will do whatever another bank tells them to, because they have their own kind of systems. So if you're going to say that you want to challenge capitalism, you should have a kind of like, maybe a backup at the very least. This is like my most basic kind of like, what is the use case? Is sort of like, well, when you are wanting to start your big struggle for the socialist revolution, or whatever you want to call it, the first thing that they're going to do is that. And then what do? Where's your money? I mean, maybe you can put it in gold bars or something like that, but you know, maybe crypto is a bit easier.
But don't you think that certain technologies, they just reinforce capitalism no matter what? It's a growth mentality, and the idea that you can use these to counter those narratives is just fool's play.
Yeah. So in some ways, I agree to an extent in the crypto space, because a lot of a blockchain is like, for it to work, there is like a profit motive for those who upkeep the infrastructure of a blockchain, right? If you are a miner or a validator of a blockchain so that it can keep this system going, you are receiving profit. Probably, theoretically, you should be receiving profit in order to upkeep your infrastructure so that the blockchain can keep running. This is due to the particular consensus mechanism, which is maybe getting, I don't know if it's too technical, but the consensus mechanism is kind of what keeps like, you know, a blockchain going, and what keeps it going for a long time. And so making profit is sort of like part of what helps the process continue to go. However, just like I mentioned earlier, this is all software, and this can all be changed. If we had the kind of social organization and ability to coordinate, we could very much choose to use a blockchain that uses a different consensus mechanism that maybe doesn't depend on a profit motive. But of course, that's like then it gets really murky, where you have to talk about politics through a very technical lens. And that's something that is like, there aren't very many spaces where you can do that. But in crypto, you can do it a lot.
And that feels like that's the thing that's the core of this idea of being radical, of becoming a blockchain radical, the title of your book. So what is a blockchain radical, and how does one become one?
Yeah, so for me, when I am referring to radical, I'm referring to like choosing a different map to understand the crypto world, blockchain world, than the one that we are given by the media, by hype men, or by gatekeepers. I like to use these two terms, but to instead like take the contradictions that come with the space kind of head on, to know that you're kind of like, if you want to make something better and different, we can't continue with the status quo of what's going on in the crypto world, but also we have to deal with, this is kind of how it exists right now. So you have to deal with kind of like these contradictions, which is the same contradiction if you are kind of like more on the radical left, where you want a different political economy, you want a post-capitalism, but you live under capitalism right now. So how do you deal with the contradiction of needing to do the things that you have to do in capitalism versus trying to live your values and your morals or whatever else to create a different world?
It certainly feels like it's a form of schizophrenia to have to live in that reality, but want an alternative.
You've read Deleuze.
I was forced to read Deleuze in 2012. Weirdly enough, when I was offered that Bitcoin, I was doing a degree specifically looking at Deleuze. I should have read him better and realized that 80 quid would have been worth every penny. You mentioned that this idea of changing these systems, and it does seem often futile, but the book does offer a little bit of help. So how do you think we can use blockchain to move towards a more equitable future?
I get asked this question a lot, and it's like kind of hard to like pin down. There's no like one thing that we can all do and that'll like fix the problem, but that there are many things. Like kind of more abstractly, I guess it would be to like engage the communities that you're in or that you are a part of or would like to be a part of, and to like use crypto where it makes sense to use it. And also one of those, so there's like the obvious things of like as a monetary kind of like workaround of the financial system or whatever else you want to do. But there's also like, for me, what is really interesting is like the idea of making democracy more like permeating through society and community, to make it more of a normal thing, I should say. That democracy should be something that we like regularly engage with, rather than like we vote every 4 or 5 years and then it's over and then we go back to work, right? We exist, depending on your works, how you work, what you do. Large companies are essentially like giant authoritarian kind of dictatorships. Like if I were to describe it, you are like given a task, you have to do that task, and then you have to make money for the guy above you so that he could afford a better car next year. If you, of course, like this is like classic capitalism, right? There are people who own, who get to reap the profits, and there are people who work in order to make their ends meet. In a world where we are more, let's say, horizontal in a way, where there is more equality between people and ownership and work, then we will have to deal with like, how do we come to decisions? How do we make sense of like the world and like everything that everyone else is doing? We cannot be doing like, I can't remember who it was, but it was like, the issue with socialism is like there's too many meetings. Like how do we like reduce the amount of meetings that we have to do, but are still able to get like very granular, very like nice input from people, or like voice, so that we can make decisions as a collective. Like, to me, that's what's like ultimately very, very interesting. What are new ways that we can collectively be together and work together and do things together and make decisions that are at least like as equal, or at least enough like productively efficient as like a giant corporation, but that is still doesn't require our like exploitation.
Was there a specific moment for you when you realized, you know what, we can use this blockchain technology to do more than just speculative economics? Did you lose a load of Bitcoin and you were like, I gotta find something else to use this thing for?
No, so also Bitcoin was advertised to me as like the thing to buy drugs off in the dark web. But I wasn't interested in it at the time. I was in college and didn't have money anyways. But so after I graduated college, I was like, oh, I need to make a bunch of money now so I can make rent. I started getting into crypto, and that was when Ethereum was really kicking off. And the idea of smart contracts were really, really interesting to me, because Bitcoin doesn't have the ability of smart contracts or whatever. So for me, DAOs were being explained. So DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, is basically like an organization that uses smart contracts for its kind of administration, to put it quickly. But I was kind of being told that DAOs are basically like, imagine Uber, but without the Uber company, where the drivers owned it and they use smart contracts to deal with all the administrative overhead of like a ride sharing app. And at the time I was like, you just explained a cooperative to me. Why are you just not calling it a cooperative? It's because they're like right-wing libertarians who like don't even know what that is. They'd like, if I were to say that, they'd be like, no, that's ridiculous. You know? So to me, that was like the moment where I was like, this is worth looking into more.
Well, there's a way to engage, and there's a way to look into some of this stuff, because as you outline in the book, we get caught in this techno-determinist mindset and worldview, and then there's technological solutionism that we look to when we get technologically determinist, and then the left spend all their time doing tech criticism of that stuff. But you suggest a new neologism, techno-probabilism. So how does that facilitate some of the stuff you're talking about there?
Yeah, so techno-determinism is like, in case you don't know, like this idea that the evolution and progress of technology determines like the world and the future. And this is like a very, sometimes it's called also the California ideology. Like it's basically like the dominant way of thinking in Silicon Valley and in a lot of the tech world and with a lot of venture capital. And so they have this kind of like imperative that if you slow down quote unquote technological innovation, then you're slowing down like the progress of humanity and evolution. And this can be very problematic, of course, for many different reasons. And so this is like often critiqued by the left and often has been used. Then, Evgeny Morozov came up with this term tech solutionism that we often, therefore, we think of every problem needing like a technology to be solved, like that we can make an app that will solve poverty, right? We just need like a new application that will, make America work. Instead, so like I needed a word to kind of like navigate the contradictions that I felt weren't being navigated. Like I felt like it was more of an identification maybe of the contradiction, but not kind of like, what is the next step? Like to me, contradiction is not something necessarily to be solved, but something to be navigated in some way. Because there'll always be contradiction in life. And so techno-probabilism for me was really about saying that technology kind of helps form the material basis of like what we can and cannot do within bounds and limits, though, that we could so much as choose to make it different if we wanted to. But it requires kind of like a social effort to coordinate and to collaborate together to make something different. And therefore there's like a probability, like a new technology is made. And if we are more organized than the bad people, the capitalists, then we will be more likely to go in a more pro-social direction with the technology. But instead, kind of what is the thing right now is that technological innovation is highly driven by the needs of capital. That if the thing that you maybe want to innovate with, and no matter what technological domain, it's not going to get any funding unless somebody can make profit off of it. For the most part, maybe you'll be lucky, you'll get grants from the state, but by and large, like open source software doesn't get funded unless there is either a giant company who is willing to give a bunch of money to them, in which case they're vastly underpaying them so that they can use it for something that's like very, very crucial for their workings, or they just so happen to have like enough people in the open source community who use it and are willing to donate.
So in other words, techno-probabilism, it's taking advantage of those latent contradictions, or those contradictions that are latent within those possibilities.
Yeah.
I mean, I confused myself there, but I'm glad you. Because this is the thing that irks me about blockchain technology. If we can just trust other people, then why do we need a technological layer to trust? Why do we need to put these things on a ledger?
Yeah, for me, the whole trust narrative is such a distraction to me. Like the usual narrative was like, you don't have to trust people. It's trustless. Like I can send crypto to you and we don't have to trust anyone. But it's kind of, you're trusting the technology. You're like trusting that it'll work, right?
Don't trust people, trust tech.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, I get the criticism because I don't agree with the premise in the first place of like that, this narrative around trust. But to me, it's much less about trust and much more about building resilient infrastructure. That if like you want to build something and you want it to last, essentially, which means you want to create an institution, like if you're not either deeply embedded within a corporation or within the state, like it's very difficult to make it last. Of course, like plenty of other types, there are plenty of like non-state and non-private institutions out there that continue to exist, but it is difficult to navigate the contradictions of capitalism, where either you make profit to survive or you are the state. That's kind of like usually we think about how society is divided up. So I think crypto brings this really, really interesting tool for people who want to make organizations, institutions that maybe don't need to be profit oriented and are not part of the state.
Well, let's talk about trying to build then that resilient infrastructure, because are there some technological pitfalls or barriers to that resilience?
It'll depend like on the specifics of what exactly you want to build, what you want to create. There are definitely technical like improvements that need to be made, like trying to onboard someone into crypto. It can be a nightmare. Getting through the KYC process for an exchange, getting the crypto and then figuring out how a wallet works and then having to store your private key somewhere. There's a lot of like education to do in order before you can get to the point you're like, all right, I have crypto in my wallet. I control it and I can do things with it. There's a lot, but I think a lot of the technical stuff is also like legal. It's also like social, but I think we're really, really nearing the point where a lot of those things can be circumvented.
Well, let's drill down on some of those examples of success, because the sort of work that you're talking about is done less by those tech bros and more by artists, activists, and programmers. So what can that group of individuals teach us about the sort of blockchains that you want to build?
Yeah, so right here in the audience, we have Ruth from further field, which I wrote about their work on culture stake, which is to me was a super cool use of blockchain, where people were able to choose like which piece of art they wanted to be displayed in this park in London. And people could do a quadratic vote between, I think it was 3 different choices. And people who just came to the park were able to sign up, and then they were given tokens and they could do the vote on a blockchain. And then what was the outcome was one particular piece of art, and then that was displayed. There's like these types of things that I find super, super interesting, and like art as being kind of like the first place we can like peer into what is possible by kind of these more, like less consequential, directly consequential things. Because now culture stake can be like, to me, with culture stake, you can imagine rather than just piece of art in the park, but like, what if you can also decide like, I don't know, that like you would like an actual park to be built in this like empty lot, and like enough people, you actually got the information that actually like 80% of the people in your neighborhood wanted this park. You didn't know that before because nobody was able to express that. You couldn't see that voice anywhere. We just kind of like have hyper normalized that like, I have no choice in things. So to me, culture stake was really interesting, where it's like you can design systems, technological, that are not authoritarian or like not kind of like top down, in the sense that like Facebook has introduced a product or Google has introduced a product and now you got to use it because you're in their like ecosystem. But that instead you can create the tools to where people can show their voice. People can then have a lot more information, become less alienated from their neighbors, to like then do like collective action together or whatever else they want to do together. And this can be applied in like, 1,000,001 different scenarios. So these are the type of like applications that I'm really, really interested in. So yeah, and that can be done on any blockchain, really.
Well, there's not just cultural applications, there's scientific applications as well. And you talk about in the book this idea of communism of science. So how can the blockchain enable more collaborative and open models for scientific progress?
So the communism of science it's like a principle of Robert Merton's kind of like, was 11 principles of science or something like that. And he was saying that communism, which is similar to communication, had like the same root word, that like science needs to be communicated. For science to be doing its best, it has to be communicated to as wide of an audience and to as many people as possible so that people can then build upon it. He's basically just like talking about open source, like that science should be open source and should not be restricted behind a paywall in the way that it often is. And so in that chapter, I was speaking about Sci-Hub, which is a project like it's basically just a one-woman show. And she basically has somehow gained access to most, if not all, of the different scientific articles that are ever published. And you can go to the websites and you can go and access the article that you want to read without having to pay the exorbitant prices that like Nature and whoever else put on their articles. And so what she's doing is not legal. She's not able to take donations in PayPal or normal bank transfers, especially if you're from like the West. And so cryptocurrency is like a great way that she's able to circumvent getting donations so people can support her work. Just getting around the financial blockade that she's under.
Well, you mentioned there culture, science, but information and communication more generally. How do you think blockchain can be used as a tool for resistance against something like censorship?
Yeah, so I would say that she's a perfect example of that, where she's being censored. She's being sued for like, I don't know how many millions in the United States and India and wherever else. only because she lives in like the eastern sphere of influence under Russia is that she's like, I think, pretty much okay. And so a lot of like, especially from financial censorship, it's like very clear. This is also the case for WikiLeaks. The original, or not original, like back in 2010 or 11, whenever WikiLeaks had their PayPal, their bank accounts all blocked, people were able to donate Bitcoin at the time. It was very early. They made a killing off of it, and they were able to sustain like everything that they've been able to do. So I mean, financial censorship, to me, this is like very clear. Crypto can get around this, and that should be taken seriously as like something that is possible. But then as well, I mean, you could think of, if you wanted to, imagine if you posted like official documents from the CIA that were like whatever stolen or something like that, and you could post that onto a blockchain. Like that's something that's also potentially possible, but it might be a bit expensive. But that's maybe another way to get around censorship. Yeah.
Well, you talk about the expense there, but blockchain technologies, they're often critiqued for being highly energy intensive. And there's an environmental and a sustainability issue that comes with them. And everything that you write about in the book comes with very good intentions for how you can use these towards more cooperative ends. But that's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
No, for sure. Luckily,
There's a technological solution.
Well, this is one of the cases where there is an uncomfortable, perhaps, truth for some people that like a technical solution was made that like fixed a lot of the problem, at least in the world of Ethereum, which is the second largest blockchain. So they moved from proof of work to proof of stake. So proof of work was a consensus mechanism that is like this kind of like uses a buttload of energy. And Ethereum was using this consensus mechanism, and basically they did a kind of like they like changed the parts of an airplane while it was flying type of situation. Like I can't kind of like the technical kind of achievement is actually like way higher than like I think people can like really understand. Like to have a blockchain like have no downtime and also change its consensus mechanism is like phenomenal. So they changed it, and they had like already since the creation of Ethereum wanted to do this change, and they did it. And there were people who didn't want it to happen, but you know, nobody cared about their opinion in the long term. And so it happened. So the only blockchain that's left that's still using proof of work for the most part is Bitcoin. And yeah, that is definitely a problem. That's why I don't really advocate for using Bitcoin so much in certain ways. Besides the political stuff, I think the environmental stuff is also very problematic about Bitcoin. So we can do, I mean, it's sort of like, we can just not use Bitcoin. That is kind of the solution, I think, for the most part. That does get around 99% of the problems when it comes to energy in crypto space.
You said that nobody cared about their opinion. I thought the whole point of blockchain was that everybody gets a stake, everybody gets a say.
Sure, they had a say. They definitely expressed their disapproval, but the vast majority of the community wanted to move to proof of stake. Part of the reason is because Ethereum had this in their roadmap from the very beginning. So it's also very different about crypto world that is important context for people, is that everything is built in public, which is not the case with Google, with Microsoft, with all these big tech companies. Everything is built in private, right? Maybe they open source some of their technology for others to use, but by and large, it's kept under like a very thick wall. In the crypto space, everything is public. Like we can all join the open like developers meeting of Ethereum if we wanted to, and take part in their discussions. They might be very technical discussions of like protocol changes to be made in Ethereum. To me, that's very, very interesting. It also, but this is part of the reason why I think it becomes very, very easy to criticize, I guess, because everything is so public in blockchain. Like when it comes to the energy question, we know the amount of energy, more or less, that Bitcoin uses because all this information is public. Like we know the hash rate, we know the power that is we can derive through different equations how much it's doing. We have no idea how much power YouTube is using or Google is using in total, like Microsoft is using. We have no idea how much these big tech companies, and they would never reveal it because they wouldn't want that type of criticism. That's why they keep it private. We're careening towards a world in crypto space, at least, where everything is being public. And so you need to deal with like the fact that it is public, and so it's easier to criticize, but it's also easier to take part in.
Well, the thing that worries me is we spend all this time doing the politics of changing some form of technology in the blockchain space, that we're not doing the politics in the real
Sure.
real world.
Yeah.
You know, that was very clear during 2020, where a lot of people weren't living out there. They were living in front of their shiny glowing rectangles, their screens, and that was the form of politics they were engaging in, partly as a hedge bet in the hope that they were going to make a bunch of cash off of the crazy spikes that were happening
Sure,
with
sure.
the Bitcoin space. So how do we bring the real and the digital together for this technology layer to have any effect?
Oh, I mean, the short answer is use it in real life. So there was like this narrative, right? Whenever social media was coming about, that now everybody can listen to all our progressive messages, and then we'll like free the Middle East from authoritarianism. That didn't really happen, in part because if you have more money, you were able to like push your narrative a lot harder for authoritarianism, and we're able to clamp down on like all these things. And like it's now become a reverse, like the narrative where governments or whoever else have the cash to kind of like bombard us with information about like disinformation campaigns and whatever else. And now there's almost an association that like the internet is right wing in some cases, or that social media especially has become that kind of cesspool. But what it has done fairly well is that it has been able to, like, everyone, I assume, got the information about this event online. And now we're all together here in person. So like we can also, if we instead try to construct like technology in which the point is to not be on it.
Right.
Like the point is to use it and then put it down and then go meet up with your friends. Like I think building things like that is kind of like the ideal use of technology, like to limit its use only to the thing that you want it to do, and then go and meet up with your friends.
So what you're saying is the incentives underlying it are perverse, but the outcomes might be liberatory.
In a sense, I mean, it's sort of like a double-edged sword, you know?
Well, in that case, what can the individuals here and what can communities do to actually make that shift in thinking and shift in action?
Well, I know a really good book. It's a
Tell
good
me
start. And yeah, I mean, I've been basically trying to cultivate a community online, at least, called Crypto Leftists. And we have a Discord, a subreddit, all those types of online community things. I have a podcast as well. I have a project that I'm working on called Blockchain Cooperative, which we're building a lot of kind of like post-capitalist applications for using crypto.
Do you think there's a problem, a societal problem or a cultural problem that you think blockchain would be rife to solve that isn't being addressed?
Kind of, yes. So like basically in our normal world, we don't experience we don't experience democracy like in a kind of like real sense. Like it's very rare that you like go into like an organization in which like everyone's voice is being heard and you're accounting for what everyone thinks and you're coming to, you know, some sort of action or consensus altogether in which you want to do something. In a world where everything is built in public and it's very difficult to kind of gatekeep certain things, it means that we're all forced to come together, like whether we want to or not. If we want to like build something that we're all going to use, it like puts a lot of more things into a commons in a certain sense, but it's a commons that is kind of like openly being privatized in the crypto space, I would say. So I think for me, flexing that like democratic muscle that we've kind of societally really lost, which means in both ways being able to express, but also recognizing your ability to express your opinion and make influence and make change, I think is what is how I would answer that. Yeah.
Well, to end, do you think there's perhaps a collectivist call to action that you'd give activists, organizers, technologists, policymakers, maybe even members of our audience this evening? Is there potentially something that we can all do to explore blockchain and its radical potential?
Well, that's a lot of different types of people, but I mean, I would say so what we're doing at Blockchain Cooperative is we're trying to create a space for people to explore this technology in a way that doesn't force you to have to engage in speculation and gambling, essentially, in the crypto world, as was often the case. So yeah, I mean, I would say to check out the work that we're doing. We have a token called Bread, which is our digital community currency. If you bake bread, then you're helping the collective. So that's an easy place to start. So trying to figure out, navigating how to do that, I would say it would be a task I would give everyone, or homework.
Right, okay. Or you can just make bread like everybody else did
Or that
during
too.
the sourdough during lockdown. So maybe it feels like there is a way we can repurpose blockchain technology towards collaborative and collective ends. I want to thank all of you for joining us at the Futures Podcast Live. I want to say a massive thank you to SPACE4 for hosting us this evening, and to Natasha Natarajan for an organization, and to Nick Goretsky of Housman Books for their partnership. Josh's new book, Blockchain Radicals, is available from Repeater Books and can be purchased from Housman's Books. If you like what you've heard, you can download the Futures Podcast on your favorite podcasting app, or follow us on social media at Futures Podcast. More episodes, live events, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking the incredibly insightful Josh Dávila.